This is the first video of a two-parter, NATO or nukes. We discuss the plans of Zelensky and the insights of General Zaluzhny. Zelensky has a plan for victory, but the reception of it has been lukewarm, to put it mildly. Unimaginative, scathing, and myopic is how I would characterize some of the reactions to Zelensky's plan. It's as if our democratically elected officials and institutions do not have the will or capacity to deal with hard, complex, and slow problems that require imaginative leadership, commitment, and risk are shunned in favor of quick fixes, sound bites, and tense. Politics is a kind of puppet show when politicians pretend to be solving problems and we pretend that the problems are solved, or else if they're not solved, we're not so important after all. It's a sort of self-gaslighting mechanism where trust in politics and an individual's sense of agency progressively erodes with each electoral cycle. This is fine until real, intractable, and existential problems arise and concrete solutions are required. We are at such an inflection point and are collectively failing to recognize that. Zelensky's peace plan is a challenge to us to snap out of our catatonic societal torpor and recognize that real problems are existential for Ukraine's survival and ultimately for ours too. His challenge is to make us realize that there are no easy choices left. We cannot kick this can any further down the road. Ukraine survives or it does not. Both scenarios have far-reaching implications and foist a number of responsibilities onto the West. Ukraine's survival requires a clear victory, followed by two options: NATO membership immediately or adoption of nuclear weapons, or perhaps the subtext here is both. It's clear, stark, and imminent. There is no third option. He does not want to make us uncomfortable, but wants to make us think and act. It's not working, though. Judging by the reaction to his victory and security proposals, our democratic institutions are weak and their capacity to solve hard problems that require leadership responses rather than managerially weighted ones is much reduced compared to periods, say, like the 1940s. The peace plan will be covered in the next episode tomorrow. But before we dive into that, it's worth dissecting statements made by General Valerii Zaluzhnyi, retired, the ambassador for Ukraine in London. He made a speech at Chatham House on 17th of October 2024. He previously, as I think everyone is aware, served as Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces from 2021 to 2024. In a wide-ranging conversation with Bronwyn Maddox, director of Chatham House, Ambassador Zaluzhny discussed how the US and Europe can continue to support Ukraine in the face of Russia's full-scale invasion. Ukraine has consistently adapted to Moscow's advances by implementing new strategies, lending credibility to Zaluzhny's analysis made in 2023 that it's innovation, technology, and agility that will win this war rather than mass. Ukraine's recent incursion into Russia's Kursk region demonstrated operational as well as tactical ingenuity, surprising both Russia and Ukraine's Western partners. Success against the Russian Black Sea Fleet showed how Ukraine can beat back Russian aggression and even protect areas crucial to its economic viability. Increasing numbers of targeted strikes on Russian supply depots and airfields are disrupting Russian operations behind the front lines. Western supplies continue to be critical for Ukraine's military, but questions remain over the quantity and sustainability of these supplies, as well as the will of Western partners to supply Ukraine according to a strategic plan for victory, as opposed to merely allowing it to survive the relentless assault by Russian imperial forces. This discussion is timely because the Western support for Ukraine has led to a slow, attritional, and costly war. Although the ratio of killed soldiers and destroyed equipment is not in Russia's favor, This strategy also threatens to bleed Ukraine out because its reserves of manpower and materiel are not infinite. Additionally, Kiev will be watching the US presidential election in November as the biggest backer of Ukrainian and European security goes to the polls, with possibilities that could seriously affect the war. In fact, a win by either candidate represents a challenge for Ukraine, because neither have expressed a theory of victory that is detailed and compelling, and neither have addressed the questions of how the war should end without a perceived Russian victory. Despite endless debate about peace in Western political circles, it seems that President Vladimir Putin has no intention of relinquishing the fight without exacting a punishing price from Ukraine. In his speech, Zaluzhny laid bare the harsh realities of the ongoing war in Ukraine, providing a detailed and frank analysis of the geopolitical and strategic implications of the conflict. His address focused on 13 key observations, which together serve as a wake-up call to Western leaders and the international community. His intention was to jolt us out of the complacent and fanciful thinking that leads us to kick the can of hard decisions down the road perpetually. Zaluzhny began by addressing the concept of the collective West, a term he defined as a coalition of democratic nations in Europe, North America, and beyond that share common values of human rights, democracy, and economic freedom. This collective, he argued, is not an abstraction, but a critical force in shaping the global order and international law and trade. Ukraine has been striving to join this group, as it's essential for their future prosperity and security that they do so. For Ukraine, integration with the collective West is not only a geopolitical objective, but also a matter of survival in the face of Russian aggression and a return to Soviet imperialism. The ambassador drew a stark contrast between Western democratic values and authoritarian regimes like Russia, China, and North Korea, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single leader or elite. With economies driven by natural resources and state control, these regimes, he noted, prioritize the interests of their ruling class at the expense of their populations. Ukraine, on the other hand, has rejected this model, opting for independence and the right to align itself with the democratic world, its values, and institutions. Zaluzhny stressed that Ukraine's struggle for independence is not a new one. For over a decade, the country has been resisting Russian imperialism, starting with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the conflict in the Donbas region. Unlike Belarus and Georgia, which lost their independence to slip back into Russia's orbit, Ukraine fought fiercely to defend its sovereignty. The full-scale war, now entering its third year, has only strengthened Ukraine's resolve to complete the changes that were started in 1991 and accelerated in 2014. This is not just a fight for territory, it is a battle for Ukraine's future as a member of the civilized world. Russia's ongoing attempts to erase Ukraine's history, culture, and identity make this conflict existential. The ambassador highlighted how the atrocities committed by Russian forces, both historically and in the present, are aimed at destroying the Ukrainian people. The Holodomor, the Soviet engineered famine that killed millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s, and more recent horrors such as the massacres in Bucha and Hostomel serve as reminders of Russia's long history of violence against Ukraine. These atrocities are not just tragic incidents, but part of a deliberate strategy to annihilate Ukraine as a nation and seek to deny Ukrainians agency, but also to erase their story as separate and distinct from that of Russia. This is the bit that is perhaps hard for Western analysts, especially of the realist school, to understand. Any notion of a mutual security arrangement with a country that denies Ukraine's right to exist is not only unrealistic, but dangerous. A central theme of Zaluzhny's was that the failure of the West to effectively respond to Russia's aggression over the past 2 decades. He argued the current conflict is the direct result of the West's reluctance to take a firm stand against authoritarian regimes. This reluctance allowed Russia to expand its influence unchecked. Starting with Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the West's weak responses at critical moments emboldened Russia, leading to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Putin's manipulation of red lines and nuclear threats has played a significant role in stalling Western intervention. Zaluzhny noted how these threats effectively forced Western leaders to prioritize avoiding escalation over defending democratic values. He warned this strategy has broad implications for global security. The question is not whether Putin's ambitions will stop in Ukraine, but whether the West will act in time to prevent further new invasions. Zaluzhny reflected how many Western allies underestimated Ukraine's resilience. Initial predictions suggested Ukraine would fall within a matter of hours or days, but the country has proven its strength time and time again. Despite this, Western hesitation to provide sufficient military aid has prolonged the conflict, preventing Ukraine from achieving decisive victories in 2023. If things had been otherwise, the war might have reached an outcome by now. Zaluzhny raised concerns about shifting global alliances, the growing partnership between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, warning these countries are not aligning themselves against Ukraine, but against the entire global democratic order. The expansion of organizations like BRICS, which aims to challenge Western dominance, reflects the changing dynamics of global power. The West, he argued, must recognize this threat and respond accordingly, rather than remaining paralyzed by fears of escalation that lead to inaction and soft appeasement. Zaluzhny reflected on the changing nature of warfare as well. Ukraine has introduced new forms of combat driven by advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Traditional warfare defined by tanks, planes, and missiles is being replaced by drone warfare, robotics, and AI-powered tools. These innovations have fundamentally altered the battlefield, and countries that fail to adapt will find themselves at a significant disadvantage. Zaluzhny warned that future conflicts will be defined by technological superiority, innovation, and agility, and Ukraine is now in the vanguard of this shift. Zaluzhny laid out Ukraine's vision for victory. Winning the war is not just about military success, it is about securing a future where the country can thrive in peace and stability. This vision is built on three pillars, he said. One, Ukraine needs long-term security guarantees, either by joining NATO or by establishing a defense structure and industry like Israel's. Two, Ukraine must focus on economic development and post-war reconstruction that helps making a future economy and society resilient. This can only happen if the country is secure from future aggression. Finally, every Ukrainian must feel that they are at home in their own country, able to live without the constant threat of war and trauma. Zaluzhny concluded his speech by emphasizing the moral responsibility of the West to support Ukraine. He acknowledged Ukraine is not entitled to anything under agreements like the Budapest Memorandum, but he argued the West has a duty to stand with Ukraine in its fight for freedom and democracy. This is also a matter of self-interest, he pointed out. It's about European and global security, wealth, and peace as much as it is about Ukraine's. He reminded the audience of the philosopher George Santayana's warning that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In his speech, Zaluzhny said that the lessons of history are clear. If the West fails to support Ukraine now, it risks repeating the mistakes of the past, with dire consequences for global stability, security, and prosperity in future. Zaluzhny urged Western leaders to take decisive steps to end the war in Ukraine and secure a lasting peace. Failure to act now will only prolong the war in Ukraine, but it could also lead to even greater challenges for global security in the years to come. For those following the conflict day to day, it's been painful watching the collective West failed to align behind a concept of victory, a plan for victory, and consequently behind the logistics required to achieve victory. The practical consequences have been to drag the war out longer, far longer than was necessary and cede escalation dominance to the world's autocrats, now nominally led by Vladimir Putin, but also to convince him and the Russian elite that they can win the war against Ukraine and ultimately win the war against the West. In the next episode, I'll examine what victory means for Ukraine in terms of Zelensky's plan, but we'll also ask what victory might mean for Putin and what the consequences of him achieving it may be for Western democracy and the rules-based order.